about the heavy hand of government, those who speak about the power of small businesses, those who speak about bureaucracy and imposition, then live your words in action and kill this vicious attack on small business across this nation. Thank you, Mr. President.
President.
Senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, I understand the passion of my colleagues from Oregon. Oregon is one of 5 states with no sales tax. I know that they have voted down a sales tax by statewide referendum repeatedly by margins of 2-to-1, I'm told. So it's clear they have a passionate feeling about no sales tax in Oregon. Here's the good news. The bill that Senator Enzi and I have introduced and want to pass in the Senate will not impose 1 penny of sales tax obligation on anyone living in Oregon, whether they're purchasing over the counter or they're purchasing over the internet. Not 1 penny of sales tax liability. Their state's rights are protected, their passion against sales tax is honored, and the same is true in Alaska, Montana, New Hampshire, and Delaware, all the other no sales tax states. But this is what it really gets down to. This isn't about the people in Oregon paying a sales tax. It's about the businesses, internet businesses in Oregon that want to sell into other states and not collect the sales tax owed to that state. That's it. And we're not forcing them to sell in Illinois or Wyoming. That's a business decision they're making. We're just saying if you sell, collect the sales tax required by Illinois law, Wyoming law, Connecticut law. That's what it comes down to. And why is it important? It's important because businesses in our state, small businesses, are competing with internet retailers who get an automatic discount when they don't collect the sales tax. And I listened to the explanation given by one of my friends from Oregon here, and he said that I'm defying the natural forces of the free market system where good quality goods are chosen over lower quality goods. Well, I can't argue about the pine trees that are grown in Oregon because I don't know if they're better than the pine trees grown in Washington or some other place. But we are dealing in many instances here with identical goods. The Nike running shoes that you can buy at Chris Koo's Sporting Goods in Normal, Illinois, or buy over the internet with no sales tax. It isn't a question of good quality versus bad quality. It's a question of sales tax or no sales tax. So what the Oregonians have suggested to us is what they consider to be a perfect solution. Remove any requirement for their internet retailers to collect sales tax from anybody. Therefore, there be no federal mandate. Well, let me remind them, there is no federal tax in this bill. There is no new tax in this bill, state, local, or federal. All we're asking for is the basics. If the Oregonians want to sell in an adjoining state like California, they'll collect the sales tax owed to California and pay it back. And then I listened to them describe how onerous this would be. Right now, eBay, which is no friend of this bill, eBay offers a service available to businesses that they can buy that will tell them the exact sales tax to be collected based on your zip code and address, and that service costs, listen to this onerous cost, $15 a month. $15 a month. If you want to go to the highest Cadillac version, $140 a month, less than $2,000 a year. And incidentally, in our bill, we require the states that are asking for the collection of sales tax to provide free of charge software to every internet retailer so that they can collect this without any expense to their business. This is not onerous, it's not unfair, it is just basic leveling the playing field. I want to yield the floor to my friend from Wyoming, my co-sponsor of this measure.
Senator from Wyoming.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I'd like to Senator Brown was here earlier and wanted to be able to speak shortly. So if when I finish my remarks, if he's here, I'd ask unanimous consent that he be able to speak. But I want to talk about what we've just heard here and an implication that we're not champions of small business. And I was in small business. I had shoe stores, retail shoe stores. And so that's why I know some of these problems. I know about the people coming in, trying on the shoes, getting exactly what fits, and having all of the service of looking through all of the styles and that sort of thing, and then leaving and making a purchase on the internet. And talking to other retailers now, that's not the biggest irritation. They buy it on the internet. It does have a problem, and every product has the potential of having some problem. They bring it back to the store where they got the free service, didn't buy the shoe, and they ask for it to be replaced. I hope people can see the inequity in that. But we're not talking about the small business like the shoe store I had. We're talking about small businesses that are selling online, and they're doing over $1 million a year in sales. I don't think people would consider that to be a really small business. $1 million in sales. And if they're doing $1 million in sales, you can pretty much guarantee that they're automated. They're automated in their manufacture, they're automated in their sales. That means they have a computer. Not many businesses today function without a computer. And if they have a computer, you would be amazed at some of the things those computers will do. I go back to Wyoming almost every weekend and I visit businesses. I visit businesses so they can tell me what kind of problems the federal government is causing for them. And I'm amazed at the automation that they have. I'm amazed at what they're able to do. And most of it is because of computers. And now we're saying, and I think that computers kind of started out on that coast, that computers just don't have the capability to do these kinds of things, to be able to figure a sales tax. All you got to have is a zip code, and you can, it eliminates the 9,600 jurisdictions that we're talking about here. And that computer can figure that sales tax, and at the end of the month, that same computer will have kept track of all of this stuff, and it will do the reports that are necessary electronically. Probably can do that with about 5 or 6 key taps, maybe less than that. I'm sure they could actually be set to send the report on the last day of the month at a specific hour. That's how computers work. So an argument that this can't be done, I don't think anybody will buy that. And the states wouldn't be willing to provide those programs free of charge and then put in the protections from liabilities and errors if they weren't sure that they could do it. That's the reason they put in those protections for the retailer, is because they're sure that it can be done. And I was fascinated by the audits. You know, if they're using that computer program, how could they vary from what they actually take in to actually sell? The program takes it in, the program holds it, the program sends it out with the report. Not a lot of room for error in there, and they're not going to be running around auditing those firms. They're going to audit the firm that looks like it's shipping everything everywhere and not reporting at all. That's what accountants do. They figure out the high risk. They're not going to go in and look for pennies here and there. They go in and they look for enough to at least cover the cost of the audit. And if you're not doing probably 10 or 20 times the value of the audit, you're not going to be hired to do many of them. So those that are complying, that are using the program, they're not going to have any problem. But this exempts all the businesses that are doing less than $1 million online in a given year. Until you do $1 million online in a given year, you're exempt from it. A lot of those, I would imagine that a lot of those nurseries don't hit the $1 million mark. They would like to hit the $1 million mark, and I would like them to hit the $1 million mark. And if they got to that $1 million mark, I think they'd be so overjoyed they'd say, I'm automating on the computer. I'll be happy to do that because maybe I can sell $2 million worth of sales if that's the case. Now, comments on the streamlined sales tax. My state was one of the first ones to get into it. So was South Dakota, so was Nebraska. And up another 21 states besides those. And the comment was, you can't streamline this. What kind of incentive has there been for them to streamline it more? The purpose of the compact is to streamline it more, but at the moment they're having to protect their sales within their state to make sure that they're not losing the revenues that they were already counting on. And they knew that there's this little Supreme Court case that's now 20 years old that challenged us to fix it. And that's what we're trying to do here, is fix it. And if that fix goes in, I'm betting that a lot more states will join the streamlined sales tax and will streamline more than what we envisioned. But even if they don't, there are requirements in here that keep it uniform enough, and with the computers, we can show examples of how people already do this sort of thing on the computer, and that should take care of a lot of their problems. I would yield the floor, and under the previous unanimous consent, Senator Brown.
Senator from Ohio.
Thank you, and I thank Senator Enzi, the senior senator for Wyoming, for his good work in this legislation and for his always courteous demeanor. Mr. President, this week I asked Nancy Spence to speak as if in morning business for up to 8 minutes. Thank you, Mr. President. This week, Senator Durbin and I are introducing the Working Families Tax Relief Act with the majority of my Democratic colleagues on the Senate Finance Committee. For a number of years, one area of bipartisan agreement in Washington has been on the need for comprehensive tax reform. Tax reform can clear the code of wasteful carve-outs, special interest loopholes. Senator Enzi was part of a meeting, a bipartisan meeting, as the Finance Committee is wont to do, sitting around a table talking about these issues just last week. We understand that comprehensive tax reform can place American companies on an even footing with foreign competitors. It can reduce the deficit, can provide a shot in the arm to economic competitiveness and growth. On that, there is agreement. With what comprehensive tax reform should not do, and there's general agreement on this also, is undermine the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit. These credits are the single most effective incentive to increase low-income parents participating in the workforce and reward work and promote family formation, all goals which we, I believe, all seek. That is why support for these programs in the past has been broad-based and bipartisan. President Reagan, former Representative Jack Kemp, former running mate in a presidential election to Senator Dole, were champions of the modern earned income tax credit. When it was expanded in 1986, President Reagan said it's the best anti-poverty, the best pro-family, the best job creation measure to come out of Congress. He was right. In Ohio, some 1 million households received EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit. 660,000 households received the CTC, the Child Tax Credit, on average in the 3 years of 2009, 10, and 11. That's why this week Senator Durbin and I, along with most of our Democratic colleagues, are introducing the Working Families Tax Relief Act. Our bill would make permanent the 2009 levels for the Earned Income Tax Credit and Child Tax Credit. It would index the Child Tax Credit for inflation. It would allow workers without children to access the full Earned Income Tax Credit. It would reduce the full Earned Income Tax Credit access age to 21, and it would simplify the filing process to reduce fraud, because there is some acknowledged fraud in this program, as there is throughout the tax system. And I've pledged to many of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, as this bill moves forward, to work to reduce that fraud. The Recovery Act of 4 years ago, expanded access and refundability for both the EITC and the CTC. It was meant to respond to the Great Recession, but also to ensure that the country's finest anti-poverty programs keep up with the times. Making these credits permanent at the current level is critical to fighting poverty. In 2011, EITC and CTC lifted 10 million people, including 5 million children, out of poverty. EITCs helped nearly 500,000 single mothers enter the workforce. These credits don't just reward work, they provide lifelong benefits to children. We know that from studies that it improves health outcomes, it increases earning potential for children in low-income families because those families pulled up out of poverty have advantages can give advantages to those children that pay off later in life that they couldn't give to those children in those families if their incomes were below the poverty line. Expectant mothers who receive EITC are more likely to receive prenatal care. These aren't opinions, these are facts. Newborns are more likely to experience improvement in birth indicators such as low weight and premature birth. Behind all these statistics, Mr. President, are real people, people whose lives and opportunities are improved because of these credits. Let me share a story. Michelle Eddy, a Cleveland native, is a single mother who works hard to support her 2 daughters. One is 9, the younger is 4. This year, the neighborhood housing services of Greater Cleveland helped Ms. Eddy prepare her tax return. She's able to use the credit she received from earned income tax credit and child tax credit to pay for school supplies, uniforms, and daycare for her 2 daughters. She'd worked in a retail store as a shift manager for 5 years. She recently, though, started a new job as a restaurant server so she can spend evenings and weekends with her daughters. Without EITC, without CTC, she would almost certainly have to work a second job to make ends meet, leaving her children at home without her far too often. The EITC and CTC aren't what make Michelle Eddy a good mother, but they enable her to be there for her children when they need her most. Right now, some 30% of children under the age of 3 are in families with too little earnings to qualify for full CTC. Even worse, nearly 13% of children under 3 are in families with no earnings and as such get no CTC or EITC. We know that the child tax credit's not indexed for inflation. By the end of the decade, another 1 million children will be forced to grow up in poverty. The CTC needs to be more robust. We need to reform the tax code now. I'm very hopeful that Senator Baucus in his last year and a half in the Senate with Ranking Member Hatch and leaders on that committee like Senator Wyden and Senator Enzi and others can reform the tax code, can put measures in place to prevent fraud. As we introduce the Working Families Tax Relief Act, I remain hopeful that our colleagues across the aisle will work with us to make these credits a part of tax reform. President, I yield the floor. And again, thanks, Senator Enzi.
Mr. President.
Senator from Tennessee.
Thanks, Mr. President. I've enjoyed the discussion on the Marketplace Fairness Act. It's good to have a good debate, and looking forward to voting on amendments that are here. I'd like to address 2 or 3 points that have been made during the debate. The first is about what we call here regular order, that and what we mean by that is that the bill is introduced and that it goes to a committee and the committee reports it to the floor and we bring it up on the floor and we have a debate and then we vote on it. We'd like to see more of that around here. Well, the problem with this bill is that the Finance Committee wouldn't act on it. I mean, let's just be straightforward about this. This bill's been around a long time, and the Finance Committee chairman is the only one who really can schedule a hearing and cause it to be acted on. He didn't want to do that, despite the fact that we asked him to do it. So as a result, the majority leader used a procedure that brings the bill to the floor. So just to underscore that, let me ask consent to place into the record a timeline for the Marketplace Fairness Act that details the steps that we've taken since 2001.
Without objection.
To summarize some of these steps, this began in the 107th Congress in 2001. Now, Senator Enzi started even before that, I think. But Senator Dorgan introduced the Internet Tax Moratorium and Equity Act in 2001. And then in 2003, the Streamlined Sales and Use Tax Act was introduced by Senator Enzi. That's 10 years ago. And then again in 2005 and 6, Senator Enzi and Senator Dorgan. And then again in 2007 and 8, Senator Enzi. In the 111th Congress, no bill was introduced, but now we're getting to a little more recent history. Last Congress, 2011 and 12, Senator Durbin introduced the Main Street Fairness Act. Senator Enzi joined him in that. It was referred to the Senate Finance Committee. So for all that time, the Finance Committee has had an opportunity to work on this legislation in the way they said they thought it should be. And there were hearings in the Senate Commerce Committee in August of 2012 on essentially the same 11-page bill that has been introduced here today and that we're acting on. And there was a partial hearing in the Senate Finance Committee during that year, but that was all. And then in this year, in February, on Valentine's Day, Senator Enzi introduced the Marketplace Fairness Act that we are debating here, this 11-page bill, and there was a letter from 16 senators, Republicans and Democrats, asking the Finance Committee to hold a hearing and to deal with it, but it has not. So I respect the decision of the chairman to be opposed to the bill and not to hold a hearing and not to report the bill to the floor. But if he does that, then I would suggest he should respect the right of the majority leader to bring the bill to the floor and allow the Senate to debate it. And as far as the regular order goes, a week should be long enough to consider this bill, which has been in one form or another around since 2001. And we could have begun debating amendments on Monday. That's when the bill came to the floor. But the opponents filibustered it. Now, this wasn't a Republican or a Democratic filibuster. It was both sides from opponents. And what that deprived us of was an opportunity to debate and vote on amendments on Monday and on Tuesday. And then we had another vote. So we've now had 3 votes, one during the budget session, one on the cloture on the motion to proceed, and then one on the motion to proceed itself, and we've gotten 74, 75 votes each time. And it's a majority of the Democratic senators, and it's a majority of the Republican senators. This doesn't happen all the time, that we have such strong majorities on each side of the aisle, saying in 3 successive votes of 74 and 75 votes, we favor an important piece of legislation. So I would hope that the better course would be to come to some agreement that we could take the amendments that we have here from Democrats and from Republicans, bring them up, table them, vote on them, debate them, and act on this and bring this to a conclusion this week. And then there's substantial support in the House of Representatives for this. The bill could then go to the House. The House could do whatever the House wishes. There could be a conference, and we could get a result. So every attempt has been made by the sponsors of this legislation since 2001 to bring this through the regular order, which means take it through the committee. And the opponents of the idea have chosen, first in the Finance Committee, to not allow there to be a markup of the bill, and then on the floor to not allow us really to debate amendments. For example, some people say that this legislation taxes the Internet. Of course, that's 100% wrong, because there's a federal law banning state taxation of the Internet, and Senator Pryor of Arkansas sought to extend that ban for 10 more years today, and the opponents of the bill objected, even to a vote on taxing the Internet. So this is very disappointing, and that is the information about the timeline that I wanted to put in. Here's some more information that I'd like to ask unanimous consent be included in the record at this point.
Without objection.
Thank you. These are letters from senators to the leaders of the Finance Committee. The first letter is dated January 31, 2012, last year, at the beginning of the year. And it goes from 5 Democrats and 5 Republicans who introduced the Marketplace Fairness Act. It asked for a hearing, asked for the committee to act. That's the first letter. The next letter came this year on February 14 from 16 senators, both parties, to the Finance Committee, asking the Finance Committee to act on the Marketplace Fairness Act. Then there's a letter to the leaders of the Finance Committee from the National Governors Association, signed by the Democratic governor of Washington and the Republican governor of Tennessee, asking the Finance Committee on behalf of the states to consider this legislation and act on it, and the Finance Committee elected not to do that. And this information will be part of the record. And finally, there's also a letter dated April 22nd of this year from the National Governors Association urging Senator Rita McConnell to pass this legislation. And I ask consent that it be included in the record.
Without objection.
Now, finally, I ask consent to include in the record the names of the governors and former governors who support this legislation.
Without objection.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. I do that with a little bit of obvious bias as a former governor, but I think it's important that the country know what the governors think, because the legislation that we're talking about today is a states' rights bill. It's an 11-page bill. It's a very simple, straightforward bill. It simply says that Tennessee, Alabama, Virginia, New Jersey, any state, has the right to decide for itself whether it wants to collect taxes that are already owed from some of the people who owe the taxes or all the people who owe the taxes. That's it. That's it. That's all it does. And the governors who support it are the governor of Alabama, Virginia, New Jersey, South Carolina, Nevada, Iowa, South Dakota, Maine, Pennsylvania, Indiana, Tennessee, Michigan, Governor Otter of Idaho, Arizona, Louisiana, Florida, Georgia, Rhode Island, Kentucky, Hawaii. I just read a bunch of Republican governors. Now I'm into the Democrats. Kentucky, Hawaii, Arkansas, California, Minnesota, Colorado, Maryland, Connecticut, Missouri, Massachusetts, Illinois, and West Virginia. And the former governors include Mitch Daniels, Jeb Bush, and the former Democratic governor of Washington. Now, Mr. President, so here we have a bill on the floor that we voted on 3 times already that has a majority of the Democratic senators and a majority of the Republican senators and 75 votes 3 times. 74 one time, 75 twice. And the bill also has the support of a long list of Republican governors, actually more Republican than Democratic governors. Yet we've got some people in Washington who say we don't trust the states to make these decisions. I wonder if these people have ever read the Constitution of the United States. I wonder if they know what the 10th Amendment says. I mean, this was a very important part of the creation of this country. Sovereign states created this country. Sovereign states had reserved to them their powers. They didn't expect to come to Washington and play Mother May I to a bunch of senators and congressmen who fly up here on airplanes and think they are smarter than they were when they left Nashville or Memphis or wherever their hometown is. The purpose of this bill is to leave within the states the responsibility for making decisions. Some people up here think they know best. Well, maybe they do, maybe they don't. I mean, Tennessee doesn't have an income tax. I'd like for every state not to have an income tax. But I'm not going to impose that from Washington just because I'm a United States Senator. Tennessee has a right to work law. I'd like for every state to have a right to work law. But I'm not going to impose that from Washington. States have the right to be right. States have the right to be wrong. And Washington has no business telling sovereign states what its tax structure ought to be. And Washington certainly has no business standing in the way of states stopping discrimination against taxpayers and businesses, because that's exactly what we're doing if we don't act. We're perpetuating discrimination. Most conservatives I know don't like picking and choosing between winners and losers. They don't like treating one taxpayer one way and one in a similar situation another way, one business one way and one another way. That's exactly what we're doing if we don't act. We're discriminating against the shoe store in Wyoming, against the boot store in Nashville, against the small store in Maryville, Tennessee. We're saying you collect the tax when you sell something, but if your competitor from outside the state sells it, he or she does not have to. That's discrimination. And that's why leading conservatives, like the chairman of the American Conservative Union, William Buckley before he died, and Art Laffer, the economist who helped President Reagan develop his ideas, and governors such as Mitch Daniel and Jeb Bush and Chris Christie and Bill Haslam. That's why these conservatives say they support the bill. Now, we're not even deciding here whether states will collect taxes from out-of-state sellers or not. We're just saying states have the right to do it. And of course they have the right to do it. So that's why I'm including this list of governors. I think it's part of our job as United States Senators to respect the sovereign states from where we come, to respect the rights of states, to not think that just because we're in Washington, we know better. Most Tennesseans don't like that. I know when I was governor, nothing used to make me madder than a bunch of legislators coming up with some bright idea in Washington, passing it, turning it into a law, holding a press conference, take credit for it, and then send the bill to me. And then next thing you know, they'd be home making a speech at the Lincoln Day dinner or the Jefferson Day dinner if they were a Democrat about local control. Well, that's about local control. And the idea that people in Washington would say that we don't trust the states to make decisions about how to spend money. Look at our record. Running up $1 trillion deficits every year, borrowing 26 cents out of every dollar we spend. I come from a state that has no state debt on roads, that has a balanced budget every year, has a AAA bond rating. I trust Governor Haslam and Lieutenant Governor Ramsey and the Speaker of the House and the Republican legislature a lot more than I do the United States Senate and Congress to make decisions about tax dollars. I think I know pretty well what they'll do if they have the power to do it. I suspect they'll say, we're not going to pick and choose winners and losers. I know they're going to say that because the governor and lieutenant governor have told me that. And I suspect what they'll say is, this will bring in more revenue, so we'll lower our tax rate because we'll start collecting money from all the people who owe it instead of some of the people who owe it. And it is correct that some governors have already said that. We were told today that in Ohio they've already said if this bill passes, they'll collect money from everybody who owes it, and then they'll lower their income taxes. Art Laffer said in his column in the Wall Street Journal, that's precisely what we ought to do to stimulate growth. He said, if we're going to have a tax, the best tax, said Mr. Laffer, is a tax that covers the largest number of people at the lowest possible rate. If that's the case, what we're perpetuating with inaction is the worst kind of tax, which is a tax that states are allowed to tax a smaller range of people at a higher rate. This permits them to tax all the people who are in a similar situated place at a lower rate if that's what they choose to do. And the arrogance of those in Washington who would say they don't trust the states to make those decisions, they need to go back to the 7th grade and read the United States Constitution and learn a little American history about where this country came from. So I'm very proud of this Senate for on this important issue, led by Senator Durbin and Senator Enzi, coming up with 75 and 74 votes 3 consecutive times to say we believe in a 2-word principle on this 11-page bill, states' rights, or 10th Amendment, that we will recognize the power of states to make their own decisions. And if we don't act, all these claims about what happens in the 9,600 jurisdictions will come true. Because some governor, I know I'd do it if I were still there, if the Senate didn't act on this, the Congress didn't act, I'd go right back to the Supreme Court. And I will bet that 20 years after the Quill case that Senator Heitkamp brought, back before there was an Internet, when the court then said that requiring out-of-state sellers to collect the tax was burdensome, they'd look at the Internet. Those justices know they can find out the weather in their hometowns by putting in the zip code and putting the name of the town, and they know that a out-of-state seller can figure out the sales tax from the zip code of the buyer. They know that. And I will predict that they would hold that it is not an undue burden, and then all the out-of-state sellers, then they'd really have 9,600 jurisdictions to deal with. So we're simplifying. We're creating something that will work. We're following a process that's well tried. There are a great many out-of-state catalog sellers and online sellers that today do exactly what the in-state sellers do. They collect the sales tax and they do it through the zip code over the internet. We're just saying everybody should do that except those who have revenues of less than $1 million a year, and they don't have to do anything under this law. And according to many economists, that takes 99% of the online sellers out of the effect of this bill. So we have tried to bring this through the regular order. We're down here trying right now. We've gotten substantial support. There have been hearings. There's a lot of work in the House. There's broad support from the governors. I'm hopeful that we'll move forward tomorrow and finish this legislation, send it to the House, and take a step toward recognizing the constitutional framework of our country by honoring the sovereign states' rights to make decisions for themselves and stopping this attitude of requiring governors and legislators to come to Washington and play mother may I with responsibilities that ought to be clearly the responsibility of states. I thank the President. I yield the floor.
Notice the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Unanimous consent that the pending quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
And, Mr. President, I don't think it'll take this long, but may I ask unanimous consent to speak as if in morning business for up to 15 minutes.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. President, I come to the floor again to address climate change, particularly today, the change that carbon pollution is wreaking in our oceans. Water temperatures are increasing, sea level is rising, ocean water is growing more acidic, and powerful storms are becoming more frequent and more intense. It is time to wake up to the threat to our oceans and coasts posed by carbon pollution. The rate at which carbon is now being dumped into the atmosphere and absorbed by our oceans is unprecedented. NOAA estimates that almost 1 million tons of the carbon dioxide we dump into the atmosphere is absorbed into the oceans every hour. 1 million tons every hour. We know with scientific certainty that carbon pollution causes the ocean to become more acidic. Indeed, we measure that carbon pollution has caused the global pH of the upper ocean to increase nearly 30%, by some measures nearly 40% since pre-industrial times. In Rhode Island, the ocean state, coastal activities define our heritage, our culture, and also our economy. Our coastal waters are spawning grounds, nurseries, and shelters for fish and shellfish, which we enjoy and from which we profit. Our shores and coastal ponds are barriers that protect our coastal communities from ocean storms and that naturally improve water quality. Our oceans and coasts make coastal states like ours, Mr. President, who we are. We will continue to take advantage of the ocean's bounty, as we should. We will trade, we will fish, and we will sail. We'll dispose of waste. We'll extract fuel and harness the wind. We will work our oceans. Navies and cruise ships, sailboats and supertankers will plow their surface. We cannot undo this part of our relationship with the sea. What we can change is what we do in return. If we use our best science and judgment to plan for the uses of our oceans, we will continue to reap the value they provide. Carbon-driven changes to our planet will continue and will accelerate. The faster you're driving, the better your headlights need to be. Our headlights in this area are scientific research and planning. As we move ever faster into this uncharted territory, our headlights had better be working to preserve the valuable ecosystems upon which our communities and economies rely. The National Ocean Policy signed by President Obama in 2010 provides a common-sense framework for sensible research and planning and public-private cooperation as we face the significant challenges bearing down on our oceans and coasts, on both our ecosystems and our industries. Last week, the White House released the National Ocean Policy Implementation Plan, a blueprint for effective management of our oceans and the Great Lakes. It's not easy to balance the competing needs of commerce, conservation, culture, and recreation. More than 20 federal agencies oversee our marine industries, governing everything from fisheries to oil and gas leasing. The implementation plan takes this on and moves us toward better and more collaborative management of ocean resources. The implementation plan gathered the thoughts of a wide range of key stakeholders: maritime and energy industries, conservation and recreation interests, academic experts, and federal, state, local, and tribal governments. The plan supports economic growth by streamlining permitting and approval processes, by improving mapping and ocean observing, and by providing greater access to data and information. The plan lays out specific actions and timelines to protect and restore coastal wetlands and reefs, and to prevent economic losses and job losses due to degraded shores and degraded waters. Our coasts need immediate attention, so the plan could not come too soon. It states, and I'll quote, "Our nation lost nearly 60,000 acres of coastal wetlands each year between 1998 and 2004. Habitats are being altered by invasive species that threaten native aquatic life and cost billions of dollars per year in natural and infrastructure damage." The implementation process that the administration is pursuing is all about local needs and concerns. So the National Ocean Policy establishes voluntary regional planning bodies. Local people can get together, layer together the relevant data, and promote greater and more responsible use of their region's ocean resources. In New England, we've seen the value of this cooperative ocean planning. Rhode Island's Ocean Special Area Management Plan. Special Area Management Plan is called a SAMP in the trade. The SAMP has made ecosystem restoration and industry interests advance simultaneously. I recently spent time at the Northeast Regional Planning Body meeting in Rhode Island, and I know that our region is excited to move forward with a regional process. So let's look at some of the practical results when you get the information and the affected people in the room together. In Rhode Island, the wind energy industry, with its vast potential for manufacturing and maintenance jobs, is rapidly developing wind farms off of our coast. Thanks to the groundwork that was laid by the Rhode Island SAMP, wind developers move fairly smoothly through the regulatory thicket, and they have avoided interference with marine highways, critical fisheries, habitats, and naval training ranges. There's actually quite a good report that I commend all my colleagues on the Ocean SAMP, published by the Rhode Island Ocean Special Area Management Plan. It's a practitioner's guide, and it's a very effective document that shows how well this worked. In this process, local people were listened to and they were heard. When the Federal Bureau of Ocean Energy Management announced this wind energy area here off of the Rhode Island coast, there was an area named Cox's Ledge, and the fishermen were concerned that the way that the floor of the ocean is there at Cox's Ledge made it a particularly rich fishing ground, and they didn't want it interfered with by having that area put up for wind farm development. And sure enough, when the map came out, you can see the curve of Cox's Ledge going right through the middle of the wind farm area, protected for the fishermen. They were listened to and they were heard. So much of this is simple common sense. In Massachusetts, the endangered North Atlantic right whale, a population of about 450 of them, feeds in the waters just off of Boston. And the whale strikes between shipping and the right whales were becoming a problem, and because the right whale is endangered, it was becoming a real risk for shipping going in and out of Boston Harbor. So they found data that showed where the whale strikes were likely, and they mapped that data. And when they mapped the data, they saw that if they just moved the shipping channel out of Boston Harbor up a little bit, they could come through an area that was largely safe from whale strikes. The cost to the industry, somewhere between 9 and 22 minutes of extra transit time, virtually nothing, while the number of whale strikes has dropped significantly. Here's another example from outside of Delaware. The green sort of neon-colored dots here track the signals coming off of cargo ships going in and out of Delaware Bay. And as you can see, there's a pretty solid track coming out of Delaware Bay right through here. Well, when Delaware first proposed its wind energy areas, they proposed these light green blocks as wind energy areas. And this one, as you can see, was planned right on top of the main shipping channel heading southeast out of Delaware Bay. Critics say that these kind of efforts to get the data and the people in the room together zone the ocean. That's just plain factually wrong. The policy brings together people who use our ocean. In this case, the case of Delaware Bay, simply putting everybody in the room allowed the wind energy areas to be modified to avoid the conflict. And so the southeastern area comes out and the turbine areas are beside it, and the problem has been solved. That is not zoning. That is what military officers would call situational awareness, what the military would call deconfliction. What it really is common sense. As Nancy Sutley, the chair of the White House Council on Environmental Quality, said, with increasing demands on our ocean, we must improve how we work together, share information, and plan smartly to grow our economy, keep our ocean healthy, and enjoy the highest benefits from our ocean resources now and in the future. Our ocean and coastal economy is important. Shoreline counties in this country generate 41% of our gross domestic product. In 2010, 2.8 million jobs were supported by maritime economic activities. Commercial ports supported 13 million jobs. Energy and minerals production supported almost 750,000 jobs. But all of this activity creates opportunities for conflict. The National Ocean Policy Implementation Plan is a blueprint to resolve those wasteful conflicts, to deconflict intelligently, and to streamline efforts across the federal government to keep our oceans and our ocean economy thriving. And it lets each region go forward at its own pace. Michael Keyworth is recent head of our Rhode Island Marine Trades Association, and he helped develop the Rhode Island Ocean Special Area Management Plan. He said this: the National Ocean Policy Implementation Plan will enable regions like New England to move ahead with this smart ocean planning by engaging people like me who live and work on the water every day, while not forcing planning on other regions that do not currently want to engage in that process. Mr. President, climate change is upon us, and its effects will only accelerate as we continue to spew megatons of carbon into our atmosphere. Changes are occurring, and they're occurring fast in the oceans. Those facts make it all the more important that Congress remain vigilant and that we put our full support behind the common-sense framework of the National Oceans Policy. Mr. President, I yield the floor. And I'll note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, I understand that we are let me ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be lifted.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I understand that we're waiting for another senator to come to the floor. So while we do that, let me speak on another subject, which is the so-called chained CPI. Last month, the Senate approved a budget that included a blueprint for balanced and responsible deficit reduction. That budget was skillfully managed by our Budget Committee Chairman, Senator Murray. It would complete the deficit reduction needed to stabilize our nation's finances with a mix of smart spending cuts and revenue from closing wasteful tax loopholes. Top economists have agreed that we need about $4 trillion of deficit reduction to make our finances sustainable, and our budget gets us there. Together with the deficit reduction enacted last Congress, the Senate budget would reduce the deficit by $4.3 trillion through a nearly 2-to-1 mix of spending cuts and revenue, 2-part spending cuts to 1-part revenue. House Republicans took a very different approach with their budget, making only cuts, drastic cuts, to education, to law enforcement, to medical research, even ending Medicare as we know it for future retirees. The House budget derives its deficit reduction from cuts that primarily hurt low-income and middle-class Americans, while refusing to touch a single tax giveaway to wealthy and well-connected special interests. Senate Democrats took a middle course. House Republicans produced an extremist Tea Party wish list. In his own budget plan, President Obama included some smart provisions like investments in infrastructure and the Buffett rule for tax fairness. And I respect the President's outreach to a compromise with Republicans, but I cannot support the cuts to Social Security benefits in his plan. It is simply wrong to place the burden of deficit reduction on seniors and the disabled. Social Security, one of the fundamental pillars of the American middle class, has not contributed and will not contribute to our deficits. Social Security is fully funded by its participants through payroll taxes and cannot by law add to the deficit. Under current payroll tax levels, Social Security will have the funds to pay 100% of benefits until 2033. It's true that we do need to make some adjustments to ensure that full benefits can be paid beyond that date, but that task has nothing to do with deficit reduction. Even if Congress did nothing before 2033, the projected shortfall would force automatic benefit cuts, not deficit spending. So I do look forward to working with senators of both parties to ensure that Social Security remains fully solvent for generations to come. But that discussion does not belong in the unrelated debate on our nation's budget deficits. The Social Security cuts the President has proposed are not just in the wrong discussion, they are wrong themselves. To reflect inflation, Social Security recipients each year get cost of living adjustments, what we call COLAs. The President's proposal changes the formula used to make that determination, shifting to something that is called the Chained Consumer Price Index, or chained CPI. Sounds technical, sounds innocuous, but make no mistake, it's a benefit cut cloaked in technical jargon. The argument for a chained CPI is that it's a more accurate measure of inflation, that it takes into account real-world decisions that consumers make to modify their buying habits as prices fluctuate. As the price of apples go up, you buy more bananas, so the overall effect on your budget is moderated. The result is lower annual cost of living adjustments, about 0.3% each year. But let's take a look at how seniors fare under the existing COLA structure. In 2010, this year, and in 2011, this year, seniors received no cost of living adjustment whatsoever. 0.0% in 2010, 0.0% in 2011. But according to the existing consumer price formula used by government accountants, prices hadn't risen enough to justify COLAs. Well, that's what the COLA formula says, but in real life, what did it look like? According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, seniors saw food prices rise 1.5% in 2010. They saw medical costs increase 3.3%. They saw their gas and home heating oil go up by more than 13% each. 1.5%, 3.3%, over 13% for gas and fuel, and the COLA covered 0%. The next year, 2011, these costs increased again, Food prices jumped 4.5%, medical care jumped 3.5%, gasoline jumped 9.9%, and fuel oil jumped 14.3%, and again, the COLA for seniors was zero. 2010 and 2011 add together. They're not included in one another. So food and beverage was a total of 6%, plus allowing a little bit for compounding, 6.8% for medical care, 23.7% for gasoline, and 27.8% for fuel oil, all with a COLA of 0%. So the numbers show what Rhode Island seniors know. The problem with the Social Security COLA is that it's too low, that it doesn't meet the real costs that seniors experience in real life. Why does this happen? The existing cost of living formula considers prices across the whole economy, including things that seniors are not so likely to buy, like flat-screen TVs and smartphones and sporting equipment. Their prices may have fallen, but seniors don't benefit much from those lower prices. The problem is that the current system fails to account for seniors' true costs in these areas. So my position is that we should move on to a more accurate formula for seniors, one that focuses on food and medicine and heating oil and gas and the other things that seniors actually buy. I've been proud to support legislation to change the Social Security COLA formula to one that is geared more towards seniors, and I will continue to fight for the adoption of that new formula. Change CPI takes us in the opposite direction. It assumes that consumers will alter the types of goods that they buy as prices rise, but seniors on fixed incomes have little ability to shift their buying habits away from these basic expenses, things like food, medical care, gasoline, and fuel oil. Hard to shift away from those things. The lower COLA that changed CPI would produce would only cut into seniors' already tight budgets and force them to bear the burden, force seniors to bear the burden of reducing deficits that Social Security had no part in creating. A 0.3% reduction each year might sound small, but over time, the power of compound interest makes those benefit cuts significant. For people who are currently nearing retirement, these cuts would amount to annual benefit reductions of $658 by the time they reach age 75, $1,147 by the time they reach age 85, and $1,622 by the time they reach age 95. And that same power of compounding makes these cuts even larger for future generations of seniors. Perhaps $658 or $1,622 doesn't sound like much money to some folks around here, but to a senior in Rhode Island living on Social Security, that is real money. After getting no COLA for 2 years in a row, Bethany, a senior from Smithfield, Rhode Island, wrote to me, "My health is not the best, and it's not easy trying to survive on my Social Security. And the increasing prices of gas, food, etc., and co-pays for medical, the COLA calculation for Social Security doesn't work. We need an increase yearly to stay even with rising premiums and everyday expenses. Please continue the fight for Social Security and Medicare." And Dean from Coventry, Rhode Island, wrote to me in February, "I am 68 years old and retired. I cannot work even part-time because of severe arthritis. My son lives with me, who is permanently disabled due to an accident when he was 9 years old. He is now 44 years old. We just make ends meet with Social Security, as we have no other income. We wear sweatshirts and pants to bed, and coats in the house during the winter, because we can't pay the high price of heating oil. If Social Security gets cut, I don't know how we will make it. I have worked all my adult life until the last 2 years. I need my Social Security. In the face of ever-increasing prices for health care, home heating, prescription drugs, and grocery bills, asking seniors to give up more and more of their Social Security benefit as they age when every dollar counts is just plain wrong. These are real-life experiences of the kind of people who change CPI would affect. Yes, we need to make additional sacrifices to complete the job of deficit reduction. No, those burdens should not fall on our elderly and disabled constituents. Our deficits come from unnecessary Bush-era tax cuts that virtually exclusively benefited the wealthy. They come from a decade of wars we didn't pay for, and they come from the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. They have nothing to do with Social Security, so don't take it out on the seniors. As the Senate budget shows, we can complete the task of stabilizing our nation's finances in smart ways, in fair ways, in balanced ways, in ways that don't put the burden on those who can least afford it. When I ran for this office, I pledged to the people of Rhode Island that I would oppose cuts to Social Security. And, Mr. President, I will keep that promise. I thank the Chair, and I yield the floor. And I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.